I was, of course, just, anxious about driving on the wrong side of the road, but it wasn't too bad in the end. But I was astonished by when I went to pick the car up. Everybody there was speaking Spanish. I thought,
Yep.
where
Yeah.
am I?
Yes. Wrong plane. So,
Mm.
I think the worst was when I was in the U.S. Virgin Islands because they still drive on the British side of the road, but they have American cars.
Oh,
So you're driving, you looked over your left shoulder and you see the sidewalk. That was truly frightening.
yeah. I sort of take my hat off to these long distance drivers, the lorry drivers in particular, in Europe who come to the UK and they have to switch in their very long journeys.
Mhm. So when they come over, is the wheel, which side of the wheel is the steering wheel on their truck?
Just the same as in your car, David. So
Oh,
they look on the left and they see the sidewalk.
see the sidewalk. Okay.
Yeah, sidewalk.
Yikes.
a friend of mine recently went to Ireland and tried driving and got into an accident with a Guinness truck. So,
Oh,
yeah, it was kind of interesting. There was beer everywhere. It was her fault because she did just what Dave said. She came through a roundabout. She went the wrong way and smashed into this truck. So,
Right.
the Irish were very gracious that, this poor American was driving in Ireland and hit a Guinness truck, but it was, yeah.
if that was me, I would have been out there licking the pavement.
Well, that's what ended up happening, Dave. That's, life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. In this case, it's, you know,
You can't waste perfectly good Guinness, that's for
that's
sure.
right. It was so, but she never will live that down for the rest of her life. So,
Good.
And just talking about Ireland, you reminded me, I am going to touch on the geopolitics a bit more, thanks to your email, Bruce. Have any of you heard of an Irish space writer called Brian Harvey?
No.
So I'll send you a link, some more details. He has a Wikipedia page. He's written loads of books. The last book was it's entitled Japan in Space. He's written about mostly Soviet Union side. He has included a lot of the American stuff, but he tends to focus on those new and upstarting countries with space programs. And he's really a specialist in China. There's been so many books on China, and particularly the interactions between the countries and the international cooperation. Brian Harvey, and he's the kind of guy who's really into the strategic international cooperation. And if that is your subject of interest, I could put you in touch with him for a future talk, Bruce. I'll send you the details. This will be up to you.
yeah, I appreciate that because when we start in a few moments, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to do when I try to get speakers on different topics, I try to have a range of topics, but I was really trying to identify experts
Mhm.
on some space programs from other countries, and either European, space agency,
Right.
especially China or Japan or India, which is why I reached out to you. So I've found it difficult to find experts on China just because a lot of things are rather, kept secret. It's a little bit more hard to extract some information. So yes, I would love to be in contact with Brian Harvey. That would be excellent. Thank you.
Great. And in fact, the most recent talk that I listened into of Brian's was about the Iranian Space Agency. So really up to speed. He just did that last month. So yeah, I'll put you in touch.
Thank you in advance. Okay,
Fascinating. Okay, well, it's
get
just
started.
about midnight UK time. I think it is midnight, isn't it?
It is spot on, yes.
Spot on midnight. So let's get this meeting underway, especially since our speaker has so graciously agreed to stay up late for this. To everybody out there in virtual land where we all are for this meeting, welcome to the February meeting of the Chester County Astronomical Society. And we're grateful to have everybody here, both on Zoom and also out there on YouTube. I would like to just touch on just one announcement. Whoops. Okay.
Sorry, carry on.
Just one announcement from my end of it. I'm looking to get an executive committee meeting either Saturday or Sunday, March 1st or 2nd, if that works for us. I'm just going to put that out there. Either private message me or send me an email after at your convenience to know if that is a good weekend for you all. We have several issues to work through, including finishing off the changes to the bylaws and the issues that we've been having with website communications and all that sort of stuff. Really does need addressed. In addition to addressing some problems with some personnel changes and things that are going to be have to made, especially with program chair. Yes, Don, I see you out there. So,
thank you.
So without, excuse me, for observing chair. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Don if he has any announcements or anything that he needs to do, or to Bruce if we want to get right into the meeting.
So I think, Dave, what we're going to do, and to all members, we're going to hold off meeting announcements and updates and everything, because I know several of us have some things to say until after Gabir's talk, just in the interest of your courtesy to the time difference for him. Okay. So stay tuned, everyone. Please don't sign off when the presentation and Q&A are done.
Fantastic.
Okay, let me just take a moment then to introduce Mr. Singh. So as I was saying a few moments ago, I've been wanting to try to identify experts in some of the space programs of other nations. And I was really interested in China and the European Space Agency, as well as India and Japan. And I guess it was a number of months ago, I heard an interview on Planetary Radio. This is from the Planetary Society with Mr. Singh, and it was with Casey Dreyer, their political advocacy person, and it was really excellent. And that's why I reached out to Gabir. So by way of an intro, Mr. Singh is a UK-based author and blogger. His background is in computer science and computer science, and he's worked in the IT sector as a cyber security consultant, and he retired about 6 years ago. So he has had a long-standing interest, and I won't go into all the details, both in avionics and in aeronautics, and he's been a pretty accomplished author. He's written several books, including one on Yuri Gagarin, and most notably, about 8 years ago, he wrote literally a tome on the Indian space program, its history, its capabilities, its future missions, etc., and including some of the geopolitical considerations. So that book, with updated, considerations of some of the recent achievements in India's space program and their future ambitions, will kind of form the basis of, I think, what Mr. Singh will talk about tonight. So, Gabir, I really appreciate you reaching out to us, and again, especially considering the hour on your end. So, without further ado, I turn it over to you.
Lovely, thank you for that. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I can.
Lovely, great.
Am I the only one?
No, we're good.
See it.
Yeah, I'm getting some thumbs up as well.
That's good.
Okay, can I just say, Bruce, you sound just like Al Worden, the Apollo 15 astronaut who I had the pleasure of meeting quite a few times. You look a bit like him, and the way you say my first name, Gurubia, just like the way he used to say it. Really appreciate that.
Take that as a good thing.
Yeah, oh yes. Okay, I've got the... Now then, why is this not scrolling? Okay. So, I think Bruce has given you the background. One of the things I did forget to do when Bruce invited me before Christmas, and I do this every year. In this selling in the UK, we have this thing called Black Friday.
Here's a shop.
Mm-hmm.
And
Is that
I have all these places where you can contact me. If you look at my YouTube channel, you will actually be able to access some of the interviews I've recorded as part of my research that I conducted for that book and indeed many others. One of the things I forgot to mention that I wanted to pass on to Bruce, if you are interested in this subject and you are interested in my books, feel free to make use of this code at the bottom of the screen in black. It's something that's available on this link, gurubeer.co.uk/shop. You can get these books on Amazon and others, and they'll be quicker, frankly, but certainly on the digital versions, feel free to use this link. And especially the book that I wrote with Brian Harvey, the space ports around the world. It came out a couple of years ago now, but it's a very big, heavy, very expensive book. If you're interested in that, feel free to use that too. Extremely optional, of course. So I wasn't expecting to do the sales pitch so early on, but I normally do forget to do that. And if any of you have any contacts in libraries and want copies for the libraries, get in touch with me. I'll be happy to do that. So, as Bruce said, the bulk of this information you're going to get is the research I conducted for that book, the Indian Space Program, which came out in 2017. It's something that took me about 5 years to write, but I was working full-time in that at that time. I made 3 separate trips to India, visited many, well, a few, it's actually a lot more, as I keep discovering, centers that ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, has. But during those 3 research trips, a couple of weeks each, I did manage to visit quite a few. I also used something called the Department of Space, which is the government department that ISRO falls under. They produce a report every year, and I can send you some links to those reports, and some of the data you'll see today is from that report from last year. And I mentioned the International Astronautical Congress that I attend. I have been doing since 5 years now, regularly. And I was in Washington, D.C. in 2019 when it was held there, and I visited the Smithsonian. I'll show you something that I picked up there which is relevant. But the International Astronautical Congress or Conference is something that will also appear, or the information from it will also appear here too. Okay. Apart from that, if you want to keep up to speed with what's happening in the Indian Space Program now, I recommend the top link, which is a Reddit source, but it's independent and there's a lot of people who provide a lot of information. That image you see on the right-hand side is a reference to various centers within ISRO. So that's the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, the URL Satellite Center, and so on. And these are all hyperlinks, and the guy who manages that site keeps them up to date. That's a really good starting point. ISRO, of course, have their own official website. It's a bit more hit and miss. Sometimes they do updates without telling you first, and the links don't work. But if you try it the day after or the week after, it's fine. And a couple of other people I follow, these are independent Indian, they're not necessarily journalists, but they're really writers, and they're independent of the government and in the ISRO itself. And there's a lot of podcasts as well as my own, which I have for a fair bit of content. So, this is the plan. It's in 3 sections: the past, the present, and the future. And in the past, I'm going to take you back to the ancient traditions of science, sort of prehistory, and then talk about something called the Indosphere. If that's a new word for you, it's a new word for me. It's certainly quite an interesting thing that came out of a book that was only published last year, and I just want to tell you about that briefly. And then talk about some of the science that was being conducted in India during the colonial period. India was colonized by Britain up until 1947, and that ended a period of about 250 years. And most of that time, it was not the British government that was the power in charge, but a private concern, the East India Company. So it's a fascinating story of the science that was conducted during that time. And things like science during the Raj refers to that colonial period. If you're not familiar with that term, Raj is the equivalent to reign. So it's during the British reign of India. And we'll talk about some of the astronomical observatories, since we have a fair bit of astronomers here, I think. And then in the present, this is just a routine stuff by ISRO, just get a feel for how big it is, what it does, where the people are, where the centers are, and some aspects of the international cooperation that I'm going to focus a bit more on that, and not as much as I want to. And I would suggest that if you have some questions, you notice in the bottom right-hand corner, each slide has a number. Make a note of that slide number. We can come back to it in the Q&A, and I'm fine for time. I don't have to get up for work in the morning or anything. And yeah, do write the questions in your chat or whatever format you'd like, and rather than wait till the end. But we will keep the questions and answers till the end. It's much easier in this Zoom format. And then I want to finish off with the future ambitions, particularly the growing impact of the private space sector. It's happening in all countries, and India is no exception. The human spaceflight program is a big thing for India right now. They're already behind, but there should be some developments, although I don't expect the first Indian astronaut to be launched into space by this year, most likely next year. And then I'm going to be very adventurous and have a guess at what the situation might be in India and the space program in about 10 years' time. So, in these three sections, I'm going to talk about some places, countries and cities which through time have changed, have come into existence and disappeared. If you follow some of this stuff in online, particularly coming out of the Indian press, just be aware, the Indian press is just like press everywhere. Some of the stuff is extremely exaggerated, and if you're not up to speed on these things, you can be easily convinced that India has already landed Indians on the moon years ago. There's a lot of nonsense out there too. And I'm going to try to stop in about altogether work to about 45 minutes to 50 minutes of this conversation, and then Q&A. So, what I'm hoping you'll get out of this by the end when I've finished, I imagine when you go home this evening, somebody asks you, so what did you do today? What did you get out of this tonight's session? You might say something like, well, we had a presentation from this guy in Manchester in England, and he spoke about India's long history in science, how the space program started, a few of the key people, like Vikram Sarabhai and Homi Bhabha. These are two names which I'll come back to, that you're probably not familiar with. But Jawaharlal Nehru is somebody you perhaps heard of, the first Indian post-independence Indian Prime Minister. And then talk about the infrastructure, the buildings that the Indian space program has, where they're located, how big they are, what they do, and the kind of capabilities and services that their Indian space program provides the people of India. And why is India doing this? Well, Gurbir said that India is doing this because its regional rival China is. And it's pretty much the same story of why Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin ended up on the moon, because of Sputnik and Gagarin. In fact, I don't know if you're familiar with a writer called Asif Siddiqui, Fordham University in the US, and he's written and he interviewed a guy called Boris Chertok. And Boris Chertok, was working in the USSR, and he was instrumental in the Sputnik 1957 and Gagarin 1961. And in one of the books he writes, he says, Boris Chertok says, that if there had not been a Gagarin, there would not have been an Armstrong. And that's pretty much the principle on which India is working on its space program, because its next door neighbor is. And then you can tell them that he had this really funny accent, and he went on talking about Manchester even when it wasn't really warranted. And oh, by the way, is this being recorded?
Yes, it's on our we recorded on our YouTube channel.
YouTube, right.
Great. Oh, in that case, I was going to say you might want to tell them that he was very good looking and very intelligent, but if you're recording this, perhaps not do that then. It'll only be found out. Okay, so this bit's going to be fairly quick. The ancient traditions of science in India and the Indosphere. If you look at the picture on the right, if you've been to India, you've probably visited places like this. It's called Jantar Mantar, and there's about 3 or 4 places in India where they exist. This one's in Jaipur, and it's a quadrant and a sundial. It's astronomically accurate. Don't need to answer this, but how old would you say that it is? When I first saw things like this, I thought it'd be hundreds of years old. It's actually just over 200 years old. Although, of course, the tradition of structures like this go back in that region much, much older. But the stuff that you see as a tourist today is not very old. If you've been to Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, they're still there. It is really a really unusual, reflecting the very long tradition of science. So this is the place we want to start. If you look at the very right-hand side picture, this is the northwestern part of India, and the shaded bit is the part of India which is associated with the Indus Valley civilizations, which predate Egyptian pyramids. And they had these very remarkably structured cities, a lot of small cities, but very large collectively. A very large number of people lived in those regions. They're on the banks of the Indus River, which is pretty much stretching from the sort of top right towards the bottom left. And it's the Indus River is the name, it's where India gets its name from. Aryabhata and Bhaskara are two of the philosophers who have written a lot about science and mathematics and astronomy, and indeed two very first satellites that India built and launched, or India built and were launched by the USSR, were called Aryabhata and Bhaskara. Oh, okay. So this ancient tradition of science in India is highlighted in this term Indosphere. It's a region of influence for over 1,000 years, from about 250 AD to 1250. And it was a time when India really became the regional superpower, I suppose, but not through military conquest, but through trade. And it's a bit like the Greek world that I remember when I was studying, that I learned that most of European science comes from the time of the Enlightenment and in the Greek period, 2 centuries and earlier. And in the same way that we're familiar with the Roman Empire, certainly we are here in England, the Greeks with Alexander the Great stretching all the way from Europe to India, there was a time when India had a similar presence. And you're familiar with the Silk Road? Well, this new book called The Golden Road is something that came out last year. And you see this picture of, in the top left, there's a number 0. It's the first time it's written down. It was in India. And the numbers that we in the UK, in Europe, call Arabic numerals, actually Indian. They just came via the Arabic world. And the largest Hindu temple it's not in India, it's actually in Cambodia, and that's Angkor Wat here. Now it's a Buddhist temple. And this came from this book I wanted to mention to you. It's called The Golden Road, came out last year. Author is a Scottish guy, William Dalrymple, well-known historian. He now lives in India, and he's written so much about India. And he's really highlighting the fact that these routes here, you can see the dotted lines, that Indian trade, incredibly large quantities of trade, went through these trade routes up the Persian Channel, towards the Mediterranean, up to Rome. Of course, we only went as far as Alexandria to Egypt, but by that time the Romans were in charge there. So today, remarkably, there are more Roman coins and gold in Indian museums than there are in England, bearing in mind that England was occupied by Romans for such a long time. So that's the historical connection that India has always had. And I want to mention, it's not, okay. I've got a couple of did you knows, some quirky little bits of information in just 2 instances, but I'll come back to that as I go through. I thought that was coming up next, but it's not. But I've got a couple of did you knows for fun, but are hopefully interesting too. But in this slide, I'm talking about the scientists and the science that was conducted during the British Raj. And of course, as an occupying power, everything that was done was in the interest of the initially East India Company up until 1858, when the British government took over, and then it was the British government's interest. A lot of people I could mention, just mentioned 4. J.C. Bose is a pioneering experimentalist, and he, like many of these guys, came from Calcutta, which is in the northeastern part of India. And he's, you've probably never heard of something like this unless you're into radio. There's something called a self-recovering coherer. A coherer is a device that we would today call a diode. And it's an element, a components necessary in the demodulation of a radio signal. And he played a part in developing the self-recovering coherer, and he also worked on some semiconductors. But it was Marconi who took that further and developed the radio from there. And it's pretty well established that J.C. Bose did quite a lot of the work there, but he wasn't interested in making it a commercial. Fascinating piece of work, but not necessarily connected with the history of radio today. Do you remember? I don't know if you remember. A few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, a film came out called The Man Who Knew Infinity. It's a film that was about a guy called Srinivasa Ramanujan. He's a mathematical genius who came from India to Cambridge, and he studied there and did a lot of incredibly fantastic mathematical work. He was a bit of a savant. If I can mention another film, Rain Man, with Tom Cruise, that kind of character, but he really did do some outstanding pioneering work in mathematics, and a lot of those mathematical things like number theory, infinite series, and continued fractions still used today. Well, he was somebody who came to the notice of the British, and he came to Britain pretty much for the 4 years of the First World War, and then he went back to India and didn't really last very long after that. But the reason why I mention him is because I get an opportunity to mention Manchester, because the guy who he studied with in Cambridge was a guy called G.H. Hardy, and he was a professor at Christ College, Cambridge, and Srinivasajan was writing to Cambridge, this professor was well known, to see if he could show him his mathematical works. And he'd received all these bundles. If you've seen this film, you know what I'm referring to. But Hardy is in Cambridge, Ramanujan's in India, and Hardy's not quite sure if he's a bit of a crackpot. So Hardy has a colleague called Gilbert Walker. Gilbert Walker had studied with Hardy, and Gilbert Walker in 1904 was appointed as the governor or the specialist and tasked with understanding the monsoons and the weather formations behind them. And he was in India, so Gilbert Walker, went to see Ramanujan, and through that visit showed Hardy that this guy was not a crackpot, and then he arranged for Ramanujan to come to Cambridge, and he studied there for the 4 years. Gilbert Walker was some of the work he did was on collecting huge numbers of data points from around India and surrounding countries. And he did all this by hand. It's 1904. So it was not computerized that we do these days. But the kind of information he gathered, he was also a mathematician. He came up with this thing called the Walker circulation. And today we know that as the El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO, which is quite an important factor that is occupying a lot of meteorologists, climatologists today. And Gilbert Walker, was from a few kilometers from where I'm sitting, near Manchester. The other guy I want to mention, C.V. Raman, he's a fascinating character. He, out of the 4 I've got listed there, is the only one who was educated and worked throughout his life in India. He did not go to Europe to study. And he was a member of the Royal Society, got a knighthood from Britain, became Sir C.V. Raman, and he also won the Nobel Prize in 1930 for his Raman scattering. And if you look at the image on the right, this refers to a device, one of the instruments on board Perseverance, which is rolling around on Mars right now. And the instrument is called Sherlock. And it's a scanning habitable environment with Raman and luminescence of organic and chemicals. So it's using the Raman scattering to identify organic compounds, if there were any, if indeed there were any. And the last person I want to mention is S.N. Bose. He worked in quantum physics. He came up, we have something today called the Bose-Einsteinian statistics. And he, you'll know, 1915, Einstein publishes his general theory of relativity. And in 1918, the very first edition of the general theory of relativity in English is not in the UK or Europe, it's actually in India, again in Calcutta. And the guy who translates that is S.N. Bose. And his, he worked along with another couple of other guys. One of them was S. Mengad Saha, both who might appear later on in this presentation. So, because Bose had contacted Einstein in 1918, and Einstein had given him the go-ahead. So Bose spoke French and German as well as English and Bengali, of course. But in 1924, he took that connection with Einstein a bit further, and he contacted him, wrote to him, he said, look, I've got this paper. I want to publish it in the publication in Germany. It was well known. It was called the Zeitschrift für Physics. But he felt, didn't have the German language capability to write from scratch a scientific paper. So he wrote to Einstein and asked him if he would do it. Of course, what he was after was the sort of, if it came from Einstein, the publisher would look at it more positively. And he did. Einstein was really, it was quite interesting actually. I think if he had not sent it to Einstein, no matter who he would have sent it to, they would not have understood it. It was so far advanced. That's the nature of the work that Einstein did when he was writing the special and general theory of relativity. So he picked the right person, but he picked the only person he could have done. And on the basis of that, S.N. Bose came to France, studied at the Marie Curie Institute for a while, and then he visited Germany and spent some time with Einstein himself. And as a result of that, they did publish, I think, at least one paper together, and the product of their contribution was the Bose-Einstein condensate, which was produced only in the 1990s as a new state of matter for the first time. Okay, some astronomical observatories. Now, we are all familiar with astronomical observatories because of the astronomy we do with them, but it was important for Britain to have those predominantly for meteorology, because there's a guy called Professor Rajesh Kochhar, who sadly passed away a couple of years, who's written extensively on the science of India, Indian science in India. And he emphasized the fact that this was necessary, not for the science, but because it was a matter of life and death. Because at that time, most of the transport was, of course, by ships, and sailing ships subject to weather, and having important meteorological information was essential. This is just before the advent of steam power. So understanding the monsoon was critical. Some of the observatories were set up with optical telescopes, something like 5, 6 or 8-inch objective, usually lenses, occasionally reflectors. Madras Observatory, Madras is known today as Chennai on the east coast. Lucknow, the north, was funded by the Nawab of Oud Oud is a place, northern India, and Nawab is like a prince or a person in charge. So he's pretty wealthy. The point being that there was some aspect of Indians who were interested in science and were willing to fund it themselves as well. Unfortunately, that observatory was ransacked during what the Indians called the First Indian War of Independence in 1857. So it didn't really do much science. Just want to mention the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India. And that was just a way of really mapping to a very high precision India. The British and the East India Company in particular wanted to know what was there, what India had in terms of landscape and natural resources. So if you look at the image on the bottom right-hand corner, it's too small for you to see, I'm sure. But what they are, this is, if you imagine three small teams of surveyors. They start off with a baseline between two of the three, measure that, and then the third goes out making a triangle, and then they triangulate and calculate the distance for that. And then through that triangulation process, work their way gradually from the north to the south of India and east and west, and many other parts of areas of India too. But this Great Trigonometrical Survey of India was something that eventually, in 1852, gave rise and recognition to the fact that Everest was the highest mountain in the world, and it was duly named after the governor of India at the time, George Everest. The bottom left-hand picture you see, again, it's not a very good one, but it's a small observatory on the top of a hill. The idea of having observatories of the top of a mountain, we're used to that today, but this was the very first observatory that was on top of a hill because it was made sense astronomically to put it there. The Astronomer Royal at the time didn't think that was made any sense. He just was not convinced that the clarity of the atmosphere was worth all the effort. And this debate took place for quite a few years and eventually was successful. And of course now we have pretty much all observatories on tops of mountains. And the Madras Observatory, that's the picture, sketch, is still there today, although it's mostly a meteorological observatory now. Here's my first Did You Know? So, can impress people when you share this. And do tell me in the Q&A if you knew this already, if you think it's worthwhile. So, the picture on the left is a wedding in 1942 in India. And it's a wedding between a guy called Firoz and Indira. And Indira is the daughter of Nehru. So she's Indira Nehru. And Indira Nehru, of course, as you now know, is the Indian Prime Minister. And so she is his daughter. But she got married to this guy called Firoz. And his name was Firoz Gandhi. He has no connections with the guy on the right, the old guy that you're all familiar with, Mahatma Gandhi. But a lot of people, if you are at a certain distance, you don't follow these things frequently, it's quite easy to think that Indira Gandhi was the daughter of Mahatma Gandhi because he, along with Jawaharlal Nehru, were of course teamed up in the Congress Party working towards the Indian independence in the decades leading up to independence. So Indira Gandhi, no connection with Mahatma Gandhi. Okay, nation building with science and technology. I remember when I was studying how the Labour government that came in the 1960s wanted to forge a new Britain out of the white heat of technology. That was the kind of thing that was happening right around the world. And India, becoming a new independent country, was focused on that task too. There's 4 pictures here. I'm going to mention another film in a moment now. The bottom right hand is Vikram Sarabhai. I know I haven't really introduced you to him. I will do that shortly. But Vikram Sarabhai is one of the names you should take away with you. Nehru, the bottom left, Prime Minister. And the top right is Oppenheimer. And the guy on the left, top left, is a guy called Patrick Blackett. Chances are you've never heard of him before. Well-known character, especially in Manchester. Oh, there you go, Manchester again. He came to Manchester and was working at the university. Did a lot of work during the war. A lot of it was secret. But if you've seen the film Oppenheimer, Christopher Nolan, I think a couple of years ago, well, the very opening scene where Oppenheimer is trying to poison his professor with a poisoned apple, that professor is Patrick Blackett. Patrick Blackett and Oppenheimer met in Cambridge, but by the time, that was very early on. Later on, Oppenheimer went to the Netherlands, studied there, and eventually in about 1937, Blackett came to Manchester. And the other reason why I want to mention Blackett is because Vikram Sarabhai was trying to study in Cambridge, started his studies in 1939, but the war broke out. And his family called him back, didn't want him to be in Europe where all this fighting was. So he studied under C.V. Raman in Bangalore, continuing his PhD. After the war, he'd finished his PhD, went back to Cambridge, but all the professors he knew were displaced following as a result of the war, and perhaps some of them had been killed. So Vikram Sarabhai, did his PhD viva in Manchester, and his examiner was Patrick Blackett. Patrick Blackett was pretty much a socialist, and he had been in touch with India already, and he'd made contact with Nehru, and later on Blackett went to become a formal advisor to the then new independent India and Nehru in his government. Nehru himself is another central part of why India chose the road for science, technology and space, because although he always dressed in this way and looked like he was a very devout Hindu, he wasn't really. Not only was he a secular individual, but he was very focused on science and technology, and he also established in the Indian Constitution, Article 51A, that every citizen in India shall develop the scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform. So when he reached out to accomplished Indian scientists around the world, most of them were not in India at the time, he said, come back to India, build India out of this new technology that's surrounding us. So that connection, the heart of the Indian government with that kind of enthusiasm for science is, I think, an important player in why India chose the road to science and space. So I am running a little slower than I expected. I'll speed up a little bit. So this present stage, this second part, is all about the Indian space infrastructure. And Bruce, I'll share this set of slides with you, so you can share this. I'll make it as a PDF, so it's not a big file as before. I'll do that tomorrow, so you can go through this at your own pace in your own time as well. So I want to talk about this guy called Stephen Smith, because he's quite an important player in the history of rocketry in the UK, and then talk about the ISRO as an organization itself. But I do want to mention two things. The pictures on the right, the flying saucer-like building is the Launch Control Center at the Sriharikota, the Launch spaceport for India. And the guy below is a guy called Professor U.R. Rao. He's one of the most nicest guy, incredibly hardworking. He did so much, and he's one of those self-effacing. He wrote a book in 2013 called India's Rise as a Space Power, which I can recommend very strongly. And he hosted my visits. Each of the 3 visits, I would go to the headquarters and he would be there. He had retired by then. And here's a tip. If you are doing some research and you want access to somebody, generally speaking, those who are acting in a current role are just too busy. They won't give you the time. And they're working on topics which are perhaps sensitive and they don't want to share. But if you go to somebody who's retired, they're much more free in communicating, and of course they've got time as well. But Professor U.R. Rao, and the 2, I could have done these as did you know really, 2 things. He was the guy who built India's first 2 satellites, and very central player, and he became the chairman of ISRO subsequently because of that. But he knew Arthur C. Clarke, because by then, in the 1970s, Arthur C. Clarke was based in Sri Lanka, and he used to visit New Delhi and Israel, of course, quite closely. And you'd be familiar with Arthur C. Clarke's paper, Extraterrestrial Relays, where he talks about using satellites for global communication. Well, Arthur C. Clarke was the first person in 1975 to get a private dish, a satellite TV dish on a private residence. And that's because he went to ISRO, and Rao wanted him to have this because of his contribution to science. And as a result, he got one. And the president of Ceylon said, well, if Clarke's having one, I should have one too. So there were actually 2 in the end. But the other thing that Rao told me was in 1962, 22nd of October, he was working in Dallas University. And he'd worked at MIT and I think JPL, working on the NASA's robotic spacecraft, the Explorers and the early Pioneers. And he would have shaken President Kennedy's hand had he not been assassinated minutes earlier. It's an interesting story, very fascinating character. Okay, history of rockets, origins, China in the 11th century, but in India, the then rulers of India were using rockets against the British in the 18th century. And as a result of the 1799 battle, where Tipu Sultan, who championed this technology for warfare, he was conquered, killed at the Battle of Polido. And as a result, the British got hold of a lot of the rockets and took them to the UK. And in Woolwich Arsenal developed the technology, and a few years later they ended up being used against Denmark in Copenhagen in 1807, and in the battle against Britain in 1814. The rocket's red glare that you have in the American anthem comes from the glare of rockets which had its origins in India. But I want to mention this guy called Stephen Taylor Hector Smith, who was developing rockets between that period of the Mysorean rockets and ISRO in the 1960s when they started. And he's somebody who's really not well known, but I just want to draw your attention to that's him there, and I put them in sort of date order. And I'll mention Robert Paganini in a moment, but Robert Goddard is around at the same time, so is Hermann Oberth. These two names you might know, and of course Sergei Korolev and Werner von Braun. But he, Stephen H. Smith, doesn't sound it, but he is Indian. I've read letters written by him in his own handwriting where he asserts he's Indian. But his mother was of mixed race. His father, white English, came from a small town in Lincolnshire, about 100 kilometers from where I'm sitting, and became a tea plant manager in India in the northwest. And during the 1934 and 1945 period, he did some rocket mail tests here. So mostly in Calcutta where he lived, to Sikkim in the north here, and in New Delhi. Not a great deal, but this is the kind of thing you're looking at. Very small rockets, about 1 or 2 feet in length, powder solid fuel, and using rocket mail. And rocket mail was a big thing at that time. The picture on the bottom right is President Eisenhower receiving some missile mail from the Postmaster General in the US in 1959. So this is after the space race. It's well after Smith's time. But rocket mail had, for a time, a presence and an importance that it no longer has today. But he, Smith, not only used it to transport mail, but also material. So he used to transport like small samples of matches, toothpaste, iodine, and cigarettes, very small quantities. But he was still demonstrating the possibility of using rockets for transport of material. And he also put in one instance, actually more than one experiment, about 3 experiments, put a small chicken and transported it, and it survived. By chance it survived. But he was the first to transport living beings by rocket power. And the reason why he didn't really make more of a impression is because he worked alone through most of his life. But I found this letter in the Smithsonian when I was there in 2019. So this is a letter from the British Interplanetary Society, and this is the first paragraph. I made it bigger here, and you can see it's from. It's to Edward Penderay. It's a name you might be familiar with, the founder of the American Rocketry Society, and it's from a guy called Phil Cleater, who was the founder of the British Interplanetary Society in 1933 on the back of the American Interplanetary Society. And Phil Cleater and Edward Penderay communicate. And this is in April 1936. And in this letter, don't know what, this is perhaps a common thing to do then. Dear Penderay, many thanks for your letter of March 24th, just to hand, just arrived. Glad that the details of the East Indian experiments reached you safely. Yes, I shall be very glad to receive the reports of Dr. Goddard's work. Thanks a lot for your promise to send copies. So this is a letter that connects the work of Goddard and Stephen H. Smith. But sadly, Smith worked alone, didn't get the support from the government, and he lived through World War II in Calcutta, which was a particularly difficult time because a Japanese incursion into India was not far from Calcutta. And then there was the Bengal famine he had to face, the riots during the independence period. But he had tried, he could see, he had the vision, he just did not have the support to develop this. And the guy I mentioned, Robert Paganini, well, he was a Swiss, he was actually a professional chemist, but he got into rocket mail and air mail, philatelist really, and they shared communication between them by letter for 25 years. And when Paganini died, he left him a very large sum in his will to Stephen H. Smith, who sadly died 6 months after Paganini himself had died. Paganini, I think, actually, it's 3 months, late 1950, and Stephen Smith died in early 1951. And they never met. Interesting story. Okay. So, want to mention the people, the founders of the Indian space program. In the big picture, you see two people, Vikram Sarabhai on the left and Homi Bhabha on the right. I'll tell you the interesting story about the picture on the top right that you can't make out in a moment. But Vikram Sarabhai and Homi Bhabha were two of the guys that Nehru pulled into his government early on. And you can see Homi Bhabha is 10 years senior, 13 years senior to Sarabhai. And it was the Homi Bhabha who set up something called INCOSPA in 1962. But Homi Bhabha was a nuclear physicist, and he was really keen on getting a nuclear power, military as well as civil, for India. And he was head of the Indian Atomic Energy Commission. So he set and he picked Vikram Sarabhai to become the chairman of the initially INCOSPA, Indian Committee for Space Research. And this is the organization which later becomes ISRO in 1961, and then through forced restructuring, Department of Space, which is the structure we have today. Homi Bhabha was a really well-known, established individual who had worked in the UK, the Cavendish Laboratory, very prominent individual. In fact, he'd got a job working at the University of Manchester, another chance to mention Manchester, in 1939 with Patrick Blackett. And in the summer of 1939, Homi Bhabha says, oh, well, I'm going to go home, visit the family in India, and be back for the start of term in September. Of course, World War II breaks out, never makes it back, and then Homi Bhabha is really a government employee and he does so much work in many aspects of not only space, but also particularly atomic energy. In 1966, he's flying over the Alps towards Switzerland, plane crashes, he, along with everybody else, dies. In a huge shock to Nehru, the Indian government, they're trying to find a replacement, and they go to this guy on the bottom right-hand side. He's called Subramanian Chandrasekhar. If you're familiar with the X-ray satellite in orbit right now, Chandra, it's named after him. He did a lot of work on stellar evolution and the Chandrasekhar limit, you might be familiar with. So they approached him, and he said, look, I'm no longer no longer an Indian national. I'm a US national now, so I can't take on your job. So they then went to and appointed Sarabhai, but Sarabhai picked up all the work that Homi Bhabha was doing. In 1912, in the Swiss Alps, a skier found a bag. You can't see this, I'm sure, it's too small. But this picture on the right-hand side is a diplomatic bag. It's quite common in those eras and even today, but I'm guessing it's a bit more secure. And the bag, on the label, it says diplomatic mail. And it has the word India on it. And it was the bag that Homi Bhabha was carrying with him for his official businesses. But both of these guys, Sarabhai and Homi Bhabha, well connected, higher echelons of the Indian government. I'm running really slow on time. And they really drive the Indian space program. The setup launch, the very first launch takes place in 1962 on the 23rd of April, 23rd of November. And because the day before was the day that Kennedy had been assassinated, it really doesn't make much in the news. It was part of the International Geophysical Year, and this launch took place from the southern tip of India, a place called Thumba. Many of the space services that India has today are the ones you'd think of: communication, Earth observation, meteorology, now navigation, and search and rescue. This is an international organization that started in 1979, initially with Canada and USSR back then, but now it's open and India takes part in that. By that, what I mean is that it has a few transponders on some of its communication satellites which provide signals at this 406 megahertz, which if you carry that kind of receiver with you, if you're out in the wilderness, you can trigger this. It's like an emergency beacon. Then the satellite will pick that up, send it down to ground station, and the ground station locally to you will then send out a rescue party. Gargan, GPS augmented navigation, nothing to do with the Gaganyaan, the human spaceflight program, just the acronyms match, and it's part of the civil aviation systems. Many of the countries, USA, Canada, and Japan have them. It allows you, it's like the GPS that we have in our cars, but work to a very high level of precision and availability. And of course, India now has space-based resources for its military, navy, and air force, and is conducting science missions to the moon and Mars with a space telescope as well in Earth orbit. Lagrangian point orbit. Structurally, Israel is directly under the control of Prime Minister and the Department of Space, and then all these organized subunits are actually the bits where all the work gets done. I just want to draw your attention to the Space Commission. It's way off to the side because it's supposed to be like a board, like a school board or a college board, supposed to have individuals independent of the government and independent of Israel, so that they can assess the kind of projects that come out of the policy and justify the value of proceeding with them or not. And apparently in 2007, when the first Indian mission to the moon was on the table, it took a lot of conversations within the Space Commission before it went ahead, because at that time it just could not be justified as a method, as something that the Indian economy, the Indian people would benefit from. A lot of the locations all over India, I'll show you a map in a moment. Vikram Sarabhai Space Center is the largest and way down south. Satish Dhawan Space Center is the second largest, it's where the spaceport is. And it's interesting, the further south you go, the more women work for Israel. And government jobs are inclusive, they keep tabs on who's working, how many women, which castes and tribes they come to. Fascinating insight into the kind of diversity that Israel as a government department is obliged to pursue. It has Thumba, that's not a good example here, but if you look at the picture on the right, that's the place of the new port. The current port is Spaceport Satish Dhawan Space Center, is just to the right as Cape Canaveral is, of course, with the on the east coast, so that it can take advantage of the rotation of the Earth for equatorial and geosynchronous orbits. But for India, Ceylon gets in the way. So to avoid this dogleg maneuver, the second port that's been authorized in India although it's very slow, hasn't really made headway, is down here. It's called Kulasekarapatinam, and it's designed for the small satellite launch vehicle. I'll summarize all the launch vehicles in a moment. Interestingly, Thumba is still used for suborbital testing and for ramjet and scramjet technology. Sriharikota, or Satish Dhawan Space Center, same place, has 2 launch pads, 2 vehicle assembly buildings, and a 3rd launch pad at Sriharikota was approved only a few weeks ago. So the idea is not only will they have an additional launch pad, it isn't essential. The first Indian astronauts to go to space from India will be using launch pad 2, so it's not a prerequisite, but in order to develop the higher launch cadence which they're expecting, they need to have an additional launch pad at the Sriharikota. Here's all the rockets that India has. Looking at the first 2 on the left, SLV-3, Space Launch Vehicle 3, and the Augmented Space Launch Vehicle 3 is pretty much the no longer in use. They've been out of service for quite a few years. SSLV is the new one, done 2 development tests, and it's operational now, but the cadence is still very low. Solid fuel, I would have thought very easy to deal with. PSLV is the most of the launches. GSLV is the one which can have a cryogenic engine, and the LVM3 Launch Vehicle Mark III is the heavy lift vehicle that India has. Human rating it, same vehicle, now called HRLV. It's a lot of acronyms, and you will find variations in different places as you go. These are some of the launch sites around India. I'll skip past this. A lot of numbers about where the people are, and you'll see this reference to strength of SC employees and scheduled ST scheduled tribes, SC scheduled castes. This is what I meant about the diversity nature of the statistics that they keep. Second, did you know? So you're all familiar with Apollo 13. I'm guessing it's because of that Indians, despite the reverence they have now for science, there is a PSLV 12 and a PSLV 14. There's no PSLV 13. Same with GSLV 12 and GSLV 14. No GSLV 13. Actually, just skip it. And you also see this picture showing you this ISRO chairman, Somnath. He stood down only this last month, and he, along with it's a tradition for all ISRO chairmen to go to a temple before a launch. Astonishing. Okay. Quick view on how much India spends compared to all the other countries. I won't go through everything, but just be aware. I always think that, for example, NASA, how much NASA spends is how much US spends on space. It's not true. Just like NASA, all other countries have other space budgets, but not part of the National Space Agency. In the US, you have the National Reconnaissance Office. You have the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration, and of course the Space Force. And that's where, in fact, most of the money in space goes, rather than NASA. And just showing you in this chart, it's from a US-based Statista.com. And whenever I've dealt with numbers, particularly financial, despite the fact that this looks very numerical and quantitative, think of it as qualitative. And in this figure, you can see that there are, in fact, India is running to about, used to be about $1 billion US dollars annual budget for Israel. And there are additional projects come along, like the human spaceflight program, Gaganyaan, that in its own got $1 billion. The space station, which recently acknowledged, also been got $1 billion. So very small budgets compared to the other players. So just be aware of the statistics, take them with a, recognize that they're never going to be precise. Very often the governments themselves don't know precisely how much the budgets are. So final section, I will finish this in the next 5-10 minutes. Future ambitions and plans. So the big thing, of course, is the human space flight. It should have happened in 2022. 2023, beg your pardon. It was announced in 2018. Big fanfare, Independence Day, and the Prime Minister announced it. Why 2023? Very important anniversaries. It's surprising how important these anniversaries can be. It would have been, 2023 was the 75th anniversary of Indian independence. And that's why it was set. Of course, as I say, probably another year or two before it actually happens. 1967 was the year of the height of the Cold War space race, and the Soviet Union picked 1967 as a year to get to the moon. Of course, Apollo 8 got there the year after, but 67 was important for the Soviet Union because it was the 50th anniversary of the revolution. So these dates have a surprisingly strong motivation for countries to do something by a particular date. Unfortunately, fortunately, the launch vehicles for the USSR just weren't up to it at that time, even though there were many people who said, oh, well, we'll risk it, even if it's one way. But sensibly, that didn't happen. And you might have heard that China, who always said that they will have their astronauts on the moon, on the lunar surface in the 2030s, 2030, 2031, 2032. A few months, last year, they made an announcement that they'll try to do it in 2029. And they're going to be commemorating their anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. So it's just surprising how some countries can be motivated by these dates. So I'm going to talk about the science missions, space stations, commercial space sector, and some of the international cooperation. So in 1971, the Indian Prime Minister got a call from the ambassador from the Soviet Union saying, hey, we could put a satellite in, one of your satellites into Earth orbit, only if it's heavier than the one that the Chinese have put up there. So this is a bit of geopolitics, and they did do that. Vikram Sarabhai tasked URL to do this, and then pretty much the same year passed away, so URL had to run with it. A bit like NASA after the promise of Kennedy to get to the moon before the end of the decade. NASA, I'm thinking, personnel felt a personal commitment to making sure that it did happen. So because of that initial connection, in 1979, Indira Gandhi got a call from the Soviets saying, oh, we can put one of your Indians into space for you if you want. And all this is part of the Intercosmos program, in the same way that during the Cold War, USA was trying to help other countries build their platform space programs by offering launch capabilities and helping training their scientists. USSR was seen as a threat, worried that they might pick capitalism rather than socialism or communism. So this battle between political ideologies was the reason why these offers were being made. India remained non-aligned throughout that time. But in 1979, India got a call from the US ambassador again for the second time. The first time a few years earlier had been declined by a previous prime minister, but Indira Gandhi had been in power just after winning an election. And when she heard this, she quite liked the idea. She went to Israel and said, can we do this? They said, yes, but what are we going to do after that? Because we're not really catered for doing anything with it. So she made a decision, and Israel, and it was UR Rao who had just taken over in 1984 as a chairman, who was in charge when Rakesh Sharma spent 7 days on Salyut 7. He spent the 2 days, he went up there with Yuri Malyashev and Gennady Strekalov. And I wanted to mention those two names because those two guys were on board a Salyut a year before, sorry, not the year before, about 7 or 8 months before, in September of 1982, when their Salyut rocket caught fire on the pad. There is a video on YouTube about this, and you can see the escape module firing, saving the lives of Malyashev and Strekalov. And it's interesting that Sharma was there watching this. And when I went to visit him and recorded my interview, he never mentioned that. I only discovered that afterwards. But it's quite a heavy, really risky business. But he did go. He had a backup, Ravish Malhotra. I didn't get to meet Ravish, but I did exchange some emails with him. There's two guys, N.C. Bhatt and Radhakrishnan on the bottom. Both were training to go up in the space shuttle in 1986, but the Challenger incident of January 1986 ended that, unfortunately. Kalpana Chawla and Sunita Williams, both of Indian origin, or Kalpana Chawla was born in India, became a naturalized US citizen, but she went up as an American. Sunita Williams, her father was Indian, but she was born in the US. Hopefully she'll come. Sunita Williams, as you know, is still in the ISS, and hopefully next few months she'll be back home. So if you're going to have launch the prerequisites for any human spacecraft launch, you need subsystems, environmental control, life support, re-entry, and so on. And you also need something called the TDRIS satellites in space. These are the tracking and data relay satellites that all countries have a constellation of, who need that direct communication, in space-to-space communication, just in case your human carrying spacecraft is not over a ground station at the time. So LVM-3 has now been human rated. The pad abort test has been conducted. There should be a launch abort test not yet conducted. There's been through uncrewed 3 on before somebody actually goes up. There will be 3 uncrewed test flights carrying, in the third one, what you can see in the bottom left-hand picture is a robot, no legs, just a robot. And the idea is that India has chosen not to test rockets and launch vehicles with animals. So they're skipping that stage altogether, and they're going to put a robot to simulate some of the symptoms from the flying in space. USA and France are helping. All the astronauts who were announced only a couple of years ago now. These are the 4 of them. They've been receiving and they've got their training completed now at the Yuri Gagarin Astronaut Training Center in Moscow. So USSR, or Russia, USA, France are all providing support for this particular project. So the idea is that there will be human spaceflight will consist of 2 astronauts in a 400-kilometer altitude for a day or a week. I suspect it'll be just for 2 days, 2 astronauts for 1 day, but it's very unclear. Just like with the timings, things like this just carry on changing. But apart from that, there was this, I'll come back to that, it's the Indo-US mission that was announced. Let me just go back. Apart from that, this year should have been the launch of an Indian astronaut to the ISS. It came out of an agreement last summer where India, I think this is part of the bartering, this is part of the haggling that India did. They wanted one of their astronauts to go to the International Space Station as part of the commitment to signing up for the Artemis Accords. India got a lot more stuff not associated with space, as well as this deal for the Indo-US program to get 1 Indian astronaut to the International Space Station this year. If it's going to happen, not sure, but that's a possibility that the first Indian astronauts, who's a government employee of the and part of the Indian Astronaut Corps, could be in the International Space Station by the end of this year. Science missions, well, there's a joint mission between NASA and Israel called the NISA. It's aperture resolution. I forgot what S is for. NISA, it's a joint mission. It's been on the cards for a very long time. It should have happened last year. And it's not pictured on this slide, but that's something which should happen this year. Chandrayaan-4 sample return. And in part, you might have heard about the SpaceX mission, which was conducted only a few weeks and months ago, when 2 spacecraft docked in Earth orbit. Important for Chandrayaan-4 as well as for the Gaganyaan mission eventually too. A bit like the Gemini was a prerequisite to Apollo. Chandrayaan-5 is a joint operation with Japan. It's going to be Japanese spacecraft or instruments on board an Indian lander, and going to land near the South Pole and really test for water. Mission to Venus also been established and paid for, or rather committed. Funds have been committed by the government for it. And it's only then when I really say that it's on the cards. Prior to that, there's usually loads of announcement, but nothing substantial behind them. So the Venus orbiter mission, there will be an orbiter, no lander, highly elliptical orbit, a bit like the Mars orbiter mission, and it will have contribution from, these are scientific payloads from Sweden, Germany, and Russia. And you can see the connection that India still has with Russia. Just although a huge number of the space missions projects and programs were with the European Space Agency were cancelled when Russia invaded Ukraine. But International Space Station, Russia is still cooperating. They're no longer using the European Space Agency's launch pad in in South America for launching their rockets. You all remember ExoMars, that was cancelled altogether, but India is still keeping its foot in the door with Russia. The picture you see here is Chandrayaan-4 sample return mission, and that's Shukrayan on the bottom right-hand corner. Space station, it's only announced a few years ago, but only last year that they actually had some funding. It'll be quite a few years. They say 2030, but I suspect that will be delayed. And you've come across something called Space Vision 1947. So that's, 2047. That's the another anniversary year for India. So they're targeting 2035, but suspect that will move. If eventually it'll be the initial module, and will host 2 or 4 astronauts, I suspect 2, for a few months. Whenever you have a space station, as you all know, you need to have a resupply mission and all the infrastructure that goes with it. And the more people you have, the more supplies you need, the greater the cadence. But initially, I think it'll just be a couple of astronauts for a few weeks. And the SpadeX mission, which I referred to a moment ago, is part of that stepping stone towards that mission. But Israel had said that the berthing ports and the airlocks, they are going to be compatible with the standards used in the International Space Station, because I suspect there'll be many more space stations coming up fairly soon. Almost to the end now. Very briefly, why did India go to the moon? Chandrayaan-3, huge success. This is a picture of them being awarded at the IAC for that success at an international platform. And if you look at the number of missions in the black text here, you'll see, perhaps get a flavor of why India is doing what it's doing and when it's doing it. And I think you can pick up that strategy from this timeline. So in 2007, China launches its first mission to the moon. A year later, India does. 2010, Chang'e 2, and then Chang'e 3 and 4. Now, in China is really organized. When they say something they're going to do, they plan on the long term, and they're very successful with it. There were 2 landers, 1 and 2, 2 orbiters, Chang'e 1 and 2, 2 landers, Chang'e 3 and 4, and 2 sample returns, Chang'e 4 and 5. And the sequence shows you that China is doing a lot more besides, but India is struggling to keep up. And if China had not done a lunar sample return mission, I'm pretty sure there would be no Chandrayaan-4. Now, apart from that, I think most space missions would want to progress and do these kinds of things anyway. That's true. But I think this indicates that the motivation, the driver for China, for India to do what it's doing is China. And particularly with the lunar mission, it's very obvious. And just one thing on the mission to Mars in 2011, China, as part of the Phobos Grunt mission, tried to send a spacecraft to Mars, or Phobos, one of the Martian moons, and that mission failed. The launch vehicle never left Earth orbit, and I think it's called Yanghu 1, the first Martian mission from China, never made it. Because of that, in 2011, India saw that opportunity and they sent their Mars orbiter mission to Mars in 2013, only because they could then say, we got there before the Chinese did. And the Radhakrishnan, who was the ISRO chairman at the time, finally did declare that was the case in a book he wrote after he left office. But while he was in office, he said, no, we're not in a race. Okay. Commercial space sector, that's where I think the growth is going to be. These are a couple of companies that I've mentioned here. Druva Space, Pixel, and Agnicol. They're developing satellites, launchers, as well as propulsion launch vehicles or propulsion for spacecraft. So they're motors to use only in space. Skyroot, Bellatrix, and Agnicol. Listen out for those names. When will India get to the moon? Well, they say 2047. SpaceX will help with that. So it is really possible because they are really full of very bright, intelligent individuals, extremely capable. And as you know from the Apollo program, Werner von Braun was saying, oh yeah, we'll be on Mars by the middle of the 1980s. And he was right, it could have been. So the trajectory was fine. It's just that all the other prerequisites, usually it's politics and money, which are the really driving factors, not the technological capabilities. I think we've shown that engineers really can step up when needed to solve otherwise unsurmountable problems. So currently, Chandrayaan-4 is the, I won't mention any dates, they keep changing them, but the human, Indian astronauts to the human, to lunar surface, or at least lunar orbit, has a target date of 2047. So, international cooperation. I mentioned that USSR, France, and USA are helping India with the Gaganyaan mission. But historically, USSR has always played a role in the development of India. And that's why India still continues to do a lot of trade. The sanctions that the US and European Union has against Russia, India isn't really following those. France provided the very first payload, very first launch from India, the Nike Apache rocket in November 1963, and it continues to provide India with support today. And indeed, the liquid engine technology India got from France. Vikram Sarabhai and Indira Gandhi both spoke French. They had really strong connections. USA, as well as the hardware, there was about half a dozen Nike Apache rockets that were provided by the US government to India to the initial testing, along with the training of the Indian scientists and engineers in the US. And India is a member of the Outer Space Treaty, UN COPUS, the United Nations Committee for Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. It participates in the Voluntary Interagency Space Debris Mitigation Coordination Committee, the Search and Rescue, COSPA SARSAT. There's also a network of optical satellites called the ISON network, or Scientific Optical Network, and India has some satellites on mountains in Dehradun which participates in that, and it monitors or locates using lasers locations of satellites. And of course now, as you see in the bottom right hand corner, India is the signatory of the Artemis Accord, not the International Lunar Research Station. Happy to return to that in a moment in the Q&A. But the key thing to get out of this is India is a democracy. It speaks English largely, and it has very strong connections with Europe. And as a result of that, it's tended to be supported by the West. But India, just like all politicians, Nehru and Indira Gandhi and others, have always played both sides because that's what's in the best interest of India. And they only went, I think, with the Artemis Accords, not ILRS, because the offers, I wrote a piece, which I'll include a link, but the Indians negotiated quite a lot more under the hood, apart from the Artemis Accords, which is what caught the headlines. So every country collaborates with others when it's in their interest. Where will we be in 10 years' time? Well, hopefully the space station will be up. There will be more space ports in India, a higher frequency of launches. The highest number of launches in India, this is to orbit and beyond, Earth orbit and beyond, was in, I think it's 2017, 8. I was expecting a lot more by now, but they still haven't really upped the number. Hopefully this year will increase. But they will also have visited Mars, perhaps with a lander and other outer planets. A high throughput constellation of satellites, a bit like Starlink service, but indigenous, Indian owned. And all of this was made possible because the private sector is on board. I think the private sector, just like in Europe and US, is where the growth will come from. UK, you might be familiar, it should have a launch of a rocket from UK soil, Scotland, northern Scotland, polar orbits, later this year. Private sector, not government. And hopefully through the Artemis Accords we'll be cooperating with India and other countries on the lunar surface in some degree. And I think it's through this international collaboration that where not only for India, but for most of us, for the human race really, where the future lies, because it's quite tough to do this, very expensive. And now that we have so many countries where this kind of capability exists, there's no reason why through collaboration this should not happen. So these are my predictions based on current trends, and I'm sure I'll be wrong because current trends have never shown that to be the case in the past. I'll stop there. I have run over a little bit. Thank you for your time. I'm open for questions now.
Thanks so much, Kabir. I have a question you sort of touched, well, you have touched upon it, but I'm just curious. The development of the commercial launch industry in India, and you named 4 or 5 of the key companies. Are they operating sort of in parallel to what ISRO does? Or is this kind of a convergence where ISRO contracts to these private launch companies or plans to contract in the same way that NASA does with SpaceX or Blue Origins? Is there that type of model, or has that not yet developed in India?
It was only last year when the final version of India's space policy, so this is formal directives from the government, was published. Draft versions have been around for quite some time, and that was necessary so that every private company can know what kind of criteria they're working to. So because India is a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty, it's subject to the Liabilities Convention, which means that if India authorizes a private launch vehicle company to launch a vehicle, launch a satellite into space, and it crashes, let's say, over Indonesia, then legally India government is obliged to pay for the damage that it would incur. And that space policy was the foundational bedstone that was necessary to be in place. Then India established something called InSpace. And it's a halfway house. So if any Indian company wants to do something, just like the Space Act that came out in the US about 6 years ago, which allowed the private companies to get the kind of permissions from the government, understand what kind of insurance obligations they'll be subject to, understand what the company that's, let's say, taking some images of the Earth from space what it can do with that data, because the Indian government still very secretive. Any high resolution data, I'll stop the share on here. Any high resolution data that's a higher resolution to 1 meter per pixel is considered to be sensitive. Now, commercially, you can get that anywhere else, but that's the kind of regulatory hurdles that needed to be clarified, and through the space policy and through InSpace, which is this in-house, in-between house that companies can go to, get all the consents from all the various government agencies that they need. That is really what was needed, and that's exactly the model that NASA operates to, and that's why I think it'll things will be speeding up now.
Thank you.
I have a question about the heavy lift vehicles, the LVM-3 and the HRLV. Are they single-use rockets that are then pretty much left to either fall into the ocean or to go off into a derelict orbit when they're uses? And how is India planning on recovering human capsules? Are they going to be using retro explosions, say as the Soviet Union uses, or are they going to be fishing them out of the ocean like we do?
So, single use, no reusability at the moment. They have this reusable launch vehicle, and in the Indian press you'll hear it as referred to as the India's space shuttle. It's quite small, it's uncrewed, and they've done a few drop tests, some launch tests, and all been suborbital, but it's very small, and it is supposed to be reusable, but it's very long. Everything that India is doing takes such a long time, and that has a consequence, which I'll come to in a second. But so India has plans in the future for a reusable launch vehicle, but right now, no. It will be a single use. Regarding recovery, in 2007, so quite a long time ago, India conducted its first, actually calls it space recovery experiment. It just had a Mercury size and like capsule, which was in orbit for about 10 days, conducting some experiments, and then it was deorbited and splashed down in the Indian Ocean and was recovered. And right now it's in a museum, which is part of the Thumba launch port, which is way down south, southern India. So they've done that experiment. They've also done in 2018 with an LVM-3, but only 2 stages, didn't have a third stage, it was suborbital, what they call the capsule recovery experiment, which was essentially, it was just a capsule like the one they're going to use for the actual Gaganyaan mission, but this is quite a few years ago, so internally it'll be very different, but size and dimensions are the same. And it went up to about 20 kilometers, and it was released, and it came down just like the splashed down, just like America does, not on land. So it's splashed down with parachutes, not propulsive landing on land. And if I can just go back to that point about when India does something, for example, the very long gaps between the first Indian mission to the moon and the second, over a decade. And what happens as a result of that is that the personnel, the teams you have, and the knowledge that goes with it just fragments and disappears. And that's what China is really good at. Because they have a very strategic view and a very long-term plan, they always keep that knowledge going forward. And with India, it's a bit like having to start again if it starts after a very long break. And there's a lot of talent that, unfortunately, people get older and they retire, things move on. but then that's lost to the immediate team that's going to be conducting it. So there's an additional cost to the slow way of doing things in India that is more than just what it looks like. So, yeah, feel free to come back to me on that, David.
Thank you. I would have thought that given the history that they had with the Russians, and that actually recovering a capsule on land is actually cheaper than having to fish it out of the ocean. I thought that perhaps India would have perhaps taken advantage of that in order to perhaps trim some costs. But it sounds like it's maybe because of their resources or because they have so much ocean front available to them and they have a good Navy, that maybe they just decided to go the direction of fishing them out of the ocean.
Yeah, I think the ocean option is easier, especially in the early days when your navigation guidance during the descent phase isn't that well developed, and you want to avoid towns and cities, and you're not quite sure you can do that. You have far more play when you choose the ocean rather than land. And I don't know if you've seen some of these images of some of the Chinese final stage from the launch vehicles and ending up in mainland China, because China does not have as much access to a coastline as India does.
Thank you.
Question about your statement on the having a space station. I was surprised to hear that they were going to do that, given how much effort it is to actually put one up there and maintain it, as well as the research that you can do there. So I'm curious, do you think it's really viable for them to put their own space station up without using other countries to help maintain it and run it?
And this is where it's really fascinating. I remember reading about in Britain, the atomic bomb development took place in the immediate few years after World War II, when Britain was broke. It had a lot of investment, it needed to invest on rebuilding the nation. It had lost its empire. It was really at a hard time. And picking the option of developing a nuclear bomb was the last thing you'd want to do economically. But they felt that they had to, because it had been pretty much an empire, and America had a nuclear bomb. They wanted one. And that's the kind of thing I think that's in play here. China has a space station. That's the only reason why India is saying it is planning for one. The point you make, I agree with you, makes no sense whatsoever. And I go further. I think the human space flight doesn't make any sense for India either, too, because it's so expensive. And the kind of bang you get for your buck is extremely small. And the same arguments were, this is what I was referring to about the Space Commission, when they were debating the way forward for Chandrayaan-1 in 2007. Or the discussions took place a year or two earlier. It was launched in 2007. There was a lot of debate, because at that point, and indeed even today, India's purpose for the space program is to help the national economy and the people. Exploring the moon, a lot of people would say, well, how does that help? You know, all the initial satellites were Earth observation, communication, and navigation and meteorology. And then, of course, the security forces got involved, because once the army had one, the navy wanted one, and then the air force wanted one, so they all had their own satellites. But science and human spaceflight and space stations, I agree with you. I don't think it's right for India to be investing that kind of money at this point. However, science, it was James Webb, the NASA administrator, during the 1960s, who was getting some flack from politicians and saying, look, we've set a goal of getting Apollo to the men to the moon and back again before the end of the decade. What are you doing with all these Explorer and Pioneer missions? It's not, it's getting in the way. And he said, no, it is really helping because he's developing the technology, understanding the science, and also, and perhaps this is the most significant, he said he's developing the know-how within the teams who will be navigating the Apollo missions to and from the moon. So there is this bedrock of scientific knowledge that you need in order for you to do anything. And in order to get that, scientific missions are the cheapest way, whereas space stations and human spaceflight, what you get for that is very limited.
I agree with it. Best bang for their buck is the robotic programs, especially going to the moon. There's a lot of open science that can be done there, and I think India can really contribute. Thank you.
There's a question in the chat from one of our student members. It says, how many satellites has the ISRO launched into space?
I think I can give you, right now, operationally, there are less than 100 in orbit. But over the time, I think I had some numbers for you in one of the slides. But usually, all the satellites they orbit that they've launched have a lifetime of about 10 to 12 years. And as a result, when you have a constellation like the navigation satellites, the slow cadence means that some of the satellites are pretty much arriving at their end of life when the other ones are launched. But the answer currently, I suspect it will be something like 75 to 80 satellites, which are in orbit and operational right now, which were launched by India.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kabir. I think maybe in the interest of time, we should let you get rest. Thank you so much. Really appreciate this presentation and the discussion.
Oh, nice to be with you. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you so much. This has been
tomorrow.
great.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
I will send you the PDF and the contact details for Brian. And thank you very much all, and good night.
Thank you. Good night. Good night.
Thanks again. That was interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So now that we've let our speaker get some sleep, and it's well past midnight for them, is there any other business that we have? I would just like to mention to any of our execs that are tuning in that we're looking for Saturday, March 1st or Sunday, March 2nd for an exec committee meeting to discuss them. But aside from that, Don, do you have anything that we want to go over now?
Yeah, I have just if I can, we're using my slides, or Don, are you projecting? I can just share mine.
No, you go ahead.
All right, you seeing that, guys?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. In the essence of time, given what we have, do you want me just to cover the observing highlights and not get into the online astronomy? I could save that for next time.
Yeah, it's getting late.
Okay. Yeah, we've lost like half of our audience. Okay. So observing highlights for this month. Tomorrow is the full moon. Third quarter is on the 20th, and the new moon's on the 27th. Planets are really quite a number in the sky. Venus is a bright crescent in the western sky, getting brighter. Mars and Jupiter are well placed all month for viewing. Saturn, if you want to see it, it's setting early, and I'll talk about this more next month, but the rings are moving into their almost edge-on position. So it's losing that wow factor, unfortunately, that our audience would love. And then they're all making a big news in the media about the 7-planet clustering. I mean, they're up all the planets are up all the time, but right now, but next month or the end of this month on the 28th, this is what they're projecting. You could get into one tight cluster in the sky. Obviously, you're going to need a telescope for Neptune and Uranus, given our light polluted skies. But you can see these others. Again, do this early in the evening. Otherwise, Saturn will have set as well as Mercury. Just a reminder for everybody, this is a good time of year for the zodiacal light. For those who don't know, this is actually the plane of our solar system, and the way when we're coming close to this time of the year, the angle of the Earth's tilt lets us look straight into sort of catching the light that's scattered from all the dust that's in the plane of our solar system. A lot of this is from around Mars. And other areas out there from asteroid collisions, etc. It's pretty cool. And that image I have up shows you pretty much what it would look like if you see it. It's really bright at the horizon and go up. I've seen this a number of times. I don't know if anyone else has. Look towards the west. You really need a dark location, though. And then our observing calendar is fairly complete. Still trying to finish some things off. I've got a few places. BRCA has committed to us up through April, but I'm going to be having a call with them actually tomorrow to talk about the rest of the year. So we'll see where that is. But I've got one scheduled with the club event on the 28th of this month, 28th of March, and 25th of April. And then every month I'm seeking another one through November, following the tradition of Friday events. Okay, so far we have 35, actually probably more closer to 40 events planned, some to be finalized. So we're going to have a very active year. I'm going to need club support to actually pull this off. First events planned for this end of this month. I know it's a little early, but I thought I'd give it a shot and see if we could get some clean weather, nice clear skies. Unfortunately, the forecast this time is cold and cloudy. So I'm not sure.
Of course, Don.
Of course.
What did you expect?
What do we expect? I mean,
Why
I
not?
can't remember. What was our success rate last year?
We're usually batting around 50% somewhere.
So we'll see if I can do better than that.
We're better than the batters in the major leagues, though.
There we go. So there's a lot of events planned. I'm not going to try to go through all of them.
Pitchers and catchers next week.
There you go. We've got solar observing events being scheduled. Roger and his wife will be doing a number of these. I'll be helping out anyone else with a solar scope. More than welcome. June 21st, we'll be doing the Family Fest at the Helicopter Museum like we've done in the past. We're also going to try to do some sidewalk events, like some solar events on the Schuylkill River Trail, as well as on the Chester Valley Trail. Some parks, camping. Dawn's going to help out with that. And I've asked John to put the calendar on our website. Last I checked, it wasn't up, but I haven't checked today. This is just looking immediately this month and next month. Like I said, the 28th at the BRCA. I'll be putting a note out to remind everybody a few days in advance, and we'll see how the weather looks, okay? The next big one that I need help with is the STEM night at Kennett Middle School on the 6th of March. They're looking for us to have a table inside and some scopes outside. This is, going to be an evening event. My hope was we could try the approach that I talked to everybody about last year, which is maybe we pick a few targets for each scope. The table inside has club info plus maybe info on the targets, and then the people outside each have a target to show something off, an idea. And so
Weather permitting, of course. How many people do we need for the tables? Probably not many.
Probably just two.
That's what we did for the museum. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then maybe 2 or 3 scopes outside, whatever we can get, would be great. And I've been working with Reagan and her team at WCU for the Astronomy Club. We're actually going to have a solar event, which is a sidewalk astronomy event, on March 17th at the Sykes Quad. Okay, so they're going to try to join us with their telescopes as well. Okay.
Okay.
And then 28th, we'll have
Keep in mind that's St. Patrick's Day.
Well, people will be drinking, but that's
The
okay.
college kids. Just
We'll try to have some green on.
Hey,
Sorry,
hey,
I'm not
that
gonna
bear
be
on the
there.
lens is sort of acts as a solar filter.
There you go.
So I think that's basically it for the observing events. Anybody have any thoughts, comments, ideas?
Just a quick question. You have my solar scope, the H alpha scope.
No,
Are the,
I
are
don't
the,
have that. What are you talking about? I'm
Just got it
kidding.
now.
I'm kidding.
But in any event, are white light filters are they useful at all?
Oh, absolutely. I'll be
Okay.
using, I was gonna bring my C11 with a white because it does beautiful job on the granulation and the sunspots.
Okay.
Because Roger's stuff does a nice job in the prominences, but he doesn't show the sunspots very well.
Okay.
And he might,
So
I don't know if since
I
it's
do have a white filter, so that with little Questar, so I could probably help out with that.
that'd be great. Yeah. Love it. And Roger probably will bring his spectroscope as well.
Cool.
I don't know if Roger's
Yeah,
online.
I know you said John's going to post a lot of these in observations, but can you maybe just send out these slides? Would you mind with some of the dates, just so we have? Since
You want me to send it to the club?
Yeah, if you wouldn't
Yeah.
mind, it would be
No
good.
problem.
Just as a added precaution given some of the issues we have.
Yeah,
Cool.
I'll do that.
Great,
I'll send it
thanks.
through Gmail.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
All right. Stop sharing here.
Okay, any other business we need to go over? Oh, yes, the scholarship fund. Any word on our students yet?
Well, just to let everybody know, we met our goal as of about 3 days ago. We've raised over $4,500, so we will be able to offer in fact, I'm going to send out a check on Friday.
Fantastic.
The three scholarships of $1,500, and we'll have about $500 cushion in our account. So cannot thank people enough. In 1 month's time, we raised a considerable amount of money, so it just kudos to the club. And just FYI, what'll happen now, a few days ago, the application period is open when students can apply for different scholarships and grants, and that goes until early April, at which time it closes. And then the committee, led by Mark Gagne, will review the applicants that we have for our scholarships, again, based on merit, their career interests, their co-curricular activities, that they're working on that are related to astronomy or planetary science. And then they'll make a decision sometime in mid-May. And then just as we've done in the last 2 years, we'll find out who the awardees are, and I'll get bio sketches, and if they permit, a photo of them, and send it to John Helper, and probably in one of the summer issues of Observations, we'll have, little bios of who the awardees are and so forth. So this is year 3, and it's gone better than the last 2. So thank you to everyone.
Fantastic job. Thanks, guys. And thanks to everybody who's contributed.
Yeah.
Okay. No other business? Well, in that case, let's wrap up our February meeting. It was a good one, interesting talk. And looking forward to next month's and what's on the docket.
Month, we have a professor from Drexel who will be coming down probably in person, and she will talk about neutrino astronomy and the ICE observatory. Again, pretty cutting edge stuff, and she's one of the leaders in the field. So that